Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. Just a reminder, of course, that Expanding Mind is quite an archive now, available on prn.fm and also on my own Technosis website. There's quite a bunch of lore there. People tend to find it and then go, "Oh my God, I had no idea," and then they dive in for some more information. If you guys don't have enough information out there, don't have enough media waiting for you to process, there you have it. Well, our guest today is Kevin Kelly of Wired Magazine, the Whole Earth Review, and the Well, the Whole Earth Electronic Link. But talking to Kevin forces me to do a little bit of back in the day. I started covering technology and the kind of the more cultural and weirdo side of technology in the late 80s as a kind of child of cyberpunk and Philip K. Dick and postmodern theory, and got hooked into the early virtual reality scene in the very early 1990s, one of the most significant days of my life in terms of my intellectual growth was the Cyberthon in 1990. I flew out to the Bay Area, and this was a very peculiar mixture of whole earth folks like Stuart Brand and cyberpunks like William Gibson and psychedelic freaks like Terence McKenna and Timothy Leary and Jaron Lanier of the early virtual reality period was there, and it was an extremely heady, interesting, wonderful, very exciting time where all of these different cultural streams, some of them fairly underground and some of them kind of coming out of the fringes of technology, came together, and it really set me going. And so I became interested in technology, though myself was only so much of a nerd. I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable in front of a terminal screen, but I don't know that many places to go with it. So I got online early on and started writing about technology and covering it from a kind of cultural journalist perspective, and that went into my book Technosis. And after I wrote I had already started writing for Wired Magazine, and so came into contact with Kevin through Wired, and I was on staff, or not on staff, on a retainer there for a number of years, and had quite a lot of fun writing pieces for Wired. But I had already knew Kevin from being a Whole Earth review guy, and really absorbing a lot of the sensibility that that Whole Earth catalog, Stuart Brand world brought. A new way, really, of doing journalism, of adding reviews of tools and technologies alongside books and records and fashions, and drawing things from all over the world. I'm still very much interested and in a lot of ways influenced by that zone. And of course, Kevin also co-founded the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which was really the first really significant non-academic bulletin board virtual community. And though I was largely a lurker on the Well, I was doing other things online at the time with listservs and MOOCs and all these now extremely archaic systems. I also was very much influenced by the kinds of discussions and ideas and characters that were brought together on the Well. And after the 2000s, early 2000s, I kind of Wired and I went different ways, and I became interested in other things. And over the years, I think, like a lot of people, I personally have become increasingly critical of a lot of the sort of, let's call it, Silicon Valley view of the world, both in terms of its relationship to capitalism, its relationship to culture. And I'm, increasingly find the internet as vexed as it is wonderful. Partly from my own personal temperament, my own political leanings, the company I keep. I retain a fairly critical relationship to a lot of new technologies that I nonetheless engage and continue to be interested in as a sort of source of cultural value and novelty. So at this point in the game, really positive views of the sort of future of digital technology, of the internet, of artificial intelligence, of the Internet of Things, all of that stuff I take with, a big spoon of salt, more than a few grains. But one person that I'm always very interested in hearing about, who is still pretty gung-ho about these matters, is Kevin. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think that there's a quality of him as a person, his earnestness, there's a humility about him, there's a kind of an almost childlike enthusiasm about the things of the world. And he was a nomadic traveler, and he's got a mystical religious side, and there's just something very human about the way that he talks about these things, where in other people's mouths it reads like corporate hype, almost a kind of way of forcing us into a certain model of reality that's dominated by neoliberal capitalist corporations. But somehow when Kevin does it, it has a much wider range. So I'm very happy that he decided to talk to me today in light of his new book, The Inevitable, Understanding the 12 Technological Forces that Will Shape Our Future. So, Kevin, thanks so much for joining me on Expanding Mind.
It's really a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, I want to start with actually just the title of your book. Now, you make the point early on that, of course, that the thing about technology is that, and I agree with this, there's an argument to be made that some aspects of it are basically inevitable, more or less, but other aspects are very different. You say, you use the example of, like, once you get electricity going and you start using electricity to communicate information, something like the internet is inevitable. And I agree with that. But obviously something like Twitter, it's not inevitable. It could have come out in a different way, a different mode of organization that would have attracted people and created different kinds of experiences. So some of this stuff is inevitable and some of it is not inevitable. Why lead with the inevitable? Why lead with the way in which there are things that we're not going to get out of at this point in the game, rather than sort of, well, there are these aspects that we have to deal with, but here's the zones where we do have control. There's been a kind of vein in your work where you kind of want to insist on, look, at this stage of the game now, some of these things are coming down the pike whether we want them to or not.
It's a fair question. I think I will also maybe just emphasize the analogy of the difference between what we should accept and what we have a choice about. Imagine rain falling on a valley. The course of a particular rain droplet as it runs down the valley to the river below is completely unpredictable. And actually, we have some control over it. We could move it around, but its direction downward is inevitable. And so, this kind of a gravity, this kind of a force, this kind of a direction, is what I talk about in The Inevitable. And I start with that because I think I want us to embrace it rather than try to prohibit, stop it, turn it down, turn it off, which is often the first reaction many people have when they realize these things are coming and they look kind of scary. And some of this stuff, frankly, does look scary, right? So there's a tendency to want to slow it down, to in some ways put it in its place. There's a kind of using our hands to stop it. And I want to use our hands to embrace it, because I think when we embrace these things, we have a much better chance of steering them. Because, in fact, most of the things that we're making, we don't know what they're going to do except by doing them. I mean, I call this thinkism, which is this idea that by thinking about things, we can solve problems. And I think that we have to do stuff to solve the problem, to find the right place for them, to figure out what they're actually really doing. And that's why I kind of like pay attention to where technology is being misused, abused, or unsupervised, because I think you get a better sense of kind of where it's going to lean. And I think we can only do that through use. And so my starting with Inevitable is to say, look, this is about accepting a certain aspect of this in order that we can then do our best job in choosing the parts of this that we have a lot of choice about that actually matters really hugely to us and that make a difference, and that it's with this engagement that we can civilize it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, in your last chapter, you talk explicitly about why you didn't really emphasize the dark side, and I'm actually kind of curious about this in terms of, part of the point of your book and indeed your work in general is to sort of draw people into opening their arms to being like, okay, there's some scary stuff, there's some things that are going to go terribly wrong, but this is where we are, and there's some really marvelous potentials for things. Let's, emphasize the latter. And so you don't do what a lot of people who write about technology do is they introduce some specific technology, then they talk about its positive side, and then they say, and it can be used in all of these negative ways, and so we have to do X and Y to try to prevent that. You really largely stay on the upbeat note. So I'm kind of curious, like, is that a strategy on your part, or is it really kind of more just reflects where you are? I mean, you're one of those people who just goes, man, this is amazing, and I can't wait to see what comes next, and I'm so excited by all the possibilities. Yeah, I see some dark stuff, but, like, I'm just really jazzed, and I'm kind of curious which of those is sort of drives the largely very positive view you have about things.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it comes from both. One is I'm just by temperament an optimistic, half full kind of a person, and I'm been very privileged and blessed to have the option to have that kind of personality. I was talking to someone you might know, Jason Silva, who grew up in Venezuela, I think it was, and
yeah.
He was describing his his state where, like, every time he went out, it's like they're kind of looking over your shoulder, something may happen, maybe you'd be kidnapped, or who knows what it is. And it's like, I was like, yeah, I mean, I would be a different person if I grew up in a situation like that. When I walk out of my house, I'm not thinking about those kinds of things. I'm thinking about, oh, wow, this is going to be a fantastic day. And so, yes, by temperament, I am more optimistic. But there's also something else, which is that my optimism is rooted in history. Is that if you take a really cold, hard look at the evidence and don't look at all about where my extrapolations, my sense of where it's going, anybody's sense of where it might go, if you just look at what we have seen so far in the last 200 years, by any metric that humans care about, the world on average has gotten better every year on average. And so that would suggest that probabilistically, statistically, it would continue to do that. It doesn't mean that it has to. It could blow up. It could collapse. There's all these. We all have the long list of reasons of why it could go wrong, but probabilistically, it won't because of the trend that we've had for 200 years. And so that's where my optimism is rooted in the fact that I had the privilege of traveling not only in Asia, but I got on a time machine and I was sent back 3 centuries, and I lived in the medieval world where there was very little technology. And I saw before my eyes what happened with these communities as they modernized and the tremendous advantages that anybody has. I mean, none of us wants to live in that life, and you particularly don't want to live it if you were born female. You don't want to live it if you were born in a lower caste. I mean, it's just like if the little thought experiment is you have a lever that can go either into the past or into the future, and the deal is you're going to be sent into the future, but you have no control over where or who you're born as. If you're going to be a random citizen in the past or a random citizen in the future, which way are you going to go? Nobody's going to go back to the past and be born in a random thing because it was terrible. And I know that firsthand. And so
Wait, how did you go back in time, Kevin?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I went back in time because I was in northern Afghanistan and parts of Nepal where these towns, these places were absolutely living exactly in medieval times, from everything, the architecture, the clothing, the social structure, the entire society was living in the 15th century, unchanged in every respect. And it wasn't just like a wild tribal thing. This was like towns and cities that had none of the modern conveniences. And I got to experience I got to experience the advantages that we've had from progress. So I know that progress was real. And while that was a very interesting experience, and there was kind of lovely to visit in that kind of touristic way, there's no way anybody wants to live there today.
Yeah, what that raises for me is that I think one of the things that we like, and one of another aspect of that is when these communities are given the opportunity, whether through specific technologies or changes in government or electricity or blue jeans or television or whatever, to go in the direction of modernity, they almost invariably do with various mixtures and holding on to certain traditions. But it's very hard from a first world point of view to say, oh no, those communities should stay back where they are because there's something intrinsically beautiful about that world. That said, oftentimes people both within those communities and people who have been along farther in the West recognize that there are certain things that you might not recognize, certain values, certain consistencies about life, certain ways that societies organize themselves through mythology, through tradition, through identity. And while those have their dark sides, they clearly have a lot of value for human beings, and that when people are let loose from them, they often get much more confused, and then there can be other kinds of pathologies that emerge that the culture before would have happened. I'm just talking about kind of the basic disruption that goes along with modernity. And
yeah,
so
it's true because, I mean, look, you're in a village, you're eating organic food, you have beautiful vistas, there is this very appropriate and actually beautiful architecture, and you know who you are. You have a very strong identity, and you have incredibly supportive families and communities. That is very, very difficult to walk away from, because it's anybody who's experienced that knows how powerful that is, to know who you are, to be supported by your community, to have this kind of very healthy lifestyle. But people take one-way bus trips away from them in the hundreds of millions, and they go to cities and live in slums. And why do they do that? They are not really being forced, except they're being forced by the fact that they have so many more choices and opportunities. They have at least the option to have electricity, even though it's intermittent. They have at least the option to go to school, even though it's very expensive and they have to pay for books and the teachers don't show up. They have so many more options that even though they know the value of what they've left, they're living in what appears to be poor circumstances, but for them, they're greater because they have more choices and possibilities. They can maybe at least have a chance of becoming a mathematician or a software engineer or a web designer, and they don't have to be the farmer that they were condemned to be back home.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's one of the most exciting things about the internet and the new models is the availability of really pretty high grade educational material to people from all over the place, and that if you have enough gumption to get online and stick with it, you can learn a tremendous amount. So I think just even within we're already seeing it, but with even a generation, the ability for clever, motivated people from very humble backgrounds from all over the world to be able to do good work, interesting work, or even just profitable work is increasing a lot, and that's a very a positive development. But talking about these kind of communities, I know that you've both written about and spent a fair amount of time with the Amish, and that they've been a kind of important sort of figure in your thinking about how communities relate to technologies, and rather than look at them as just some backwards, stuck in the past, neo-Luddite, religious crazies. You really have a great deal of respect in many ways for the Amish. Could you talk a little bit about your experience there, and then particularly how it relates to this question of how to hold on to certain kinds of traditions, let's say, while integrating into the current technosphere?
Yeah, I mean, they are all the things you said plus more. First of all, the first thing people should understand about the Amish is that they're not singular, homogeneous. There are actually many different flavors and varieties, and their own practices vary, what they call parish by parish, so that it is a little bit hard to generalize. But there are several things about them that I think we can generalize, which is they make their choices about what technologies they're going to accept or not collectively. Whereas most Americans, who, by the way, make almost as many weird choices about what they accept and don't accept, but we do it individually. And so it's that collective societal aspect of the technology that I was very interested in. And the reason that if you spend much time, you realize that they're actually not anti-technology at all. They're actually kind of hackerish in some senses, because they take the rules and they're always kind of pushing the edge of whatever rule that they're trying to bend. But that the better way to think of them is that they're kind of 50 to 60 years behind us in what they adopt in the more liberal versions of them. As I said, there are still some parishes who, or maybe 100 years behind, but they slowly adopt things, and they have two criteria, or three maybe, criteria for what they accept. And the criteria, the main criteria that they use technology for is they use the unacceptance of technology is mostly for their identity. Their identity is being separate. So that's why they may use solar power, but they don't have wires to their homes, because the wires indicate that they're connected. And if they have solar, then they're not connected, but they're still using electricity. And the second thing that the criteria is that they want to use technologies that will enable them to have 3 meals a day with their family, the whole family together for 3 meals. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner together as a family. So that means that they're looking for technologies and livelihoods that will allow them to be at home or near home, so they can come home. And kids come home from school at lunch as well. And so that's the thing. So when they look at the technology, they'll say, well, can we use it at home in our backyard? And so that cuts out a lot of stuff and actually makes it kind of appropriate in that sense for the family homestead. And the third one, which is also really critical, is that they're looking for technology that will bring their community together, that will enhance their community. And that's why there are versions of the Amish who have electricity, but they use horse and buggy. And they use the horse and buggy because they can only go about 15 miles in a day. And that means that they're restricted to how far away they can go. So they have to shop locally. They have to go to the doctor or the dentist locally. They have to visit or recreate when they have time off on Sunday. They can only go within the community. So that kind of brings their community together. So the whole point of it is not because they have anything against cars. It's because they have something for the community. So they go through a process of a collective process of evaluating where something new, like say cell phones. Does cell phones help the family? Does it bind the community? Does it help their identity? And interestingly, some of the communities are accepting cell phones, even though they don't have electricity or wires to the house. Even though they may not have cars, they've got cell phones. And it sounds kind of crazy, but they have this logic and reason about using it, and they often use it only, say, in the barn or in their cart, but they have restrictions for it. And so the important thing is that they have a conversation about it among themselves.
Well, I want to talk about, there's like two things you brought up here that resonate with me in terms of your book. One is this issue of the community. One of the interesting developments I see in the inevitable, in contrast, well, not in total contrast, but that you're more explicit about here, and you talk about it how you basically come from more of a libertarian background, but that you have increasing respect for the power of the collective and communities within technology. And you talk about a number of different examples of this. And you're even willing to go that Bernie Sanders extra level of invoking the dread word socialism, which I congratulate you for. I think it's a very important word to keep in circulation. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about why you went that far. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, it's great that, communities of software developers can work for free and come up with, Apache, or to say all the people who, collectively contribute to Wikipedia and look at the amazing thing that comes out of it, although there are some issues, and maybe we'll talk about them. But it's another thing to really start to think, wow, actually we might really be looking at the emergence of forms of relating that offer a different model than capitalism, or one that works alongside it, that we can think of in terms of socialism, in terms of collective ownership, in terms of new forms of collectivity that aren't the old Marxist forms, but still share something of that lineage, as well as the rugged individualist hacker libertarian that we see more kind of obviously in a lot of the Silicon Valley mythology. Can you talk about that shift for you, like why the word socialism it becomes available for you at this point?
Yeah, it's a good point, because I was just doing some interviews with people in England and Europe who don't have that same association of baggage with socialism as a term as the Americans do. So it's particularly heavy with overtones for Americans, but not necessarily for people from the rest of the world. And I was kind of reduced to using it because all the other words related to it are also equally tainted and Americanized. And I just thought, hey, it's actually the best word for trying to describe what this is about, and we'll just try to redeem it. And the idea is simply that I think maybe the largest trend over the past 30, 40 years in technology has been the invention and dissemination and amplification of communication, which allows us to cooperate in forms and scales and speed that were not possible before. And I buy kind of Robert Wright's, the author of Non-Zeros, his basic premise that civilization, all that we think most highly about humans, is a result of increasing levels of cooperation and sophisticated ways of cooperating, from the early humans who cooperated to hunt, to the tribes, to so forth. We've just layered on more and more ways in which we can actually cooperate, and that's sort of the basis of all progress. And that what we've now recently been doing is inventing technologies that allow us to cooperate in many, many new dimensions, many ways that were just simply impossible before. And so one of those ways, the kind of most obvious, is like you think of something like Facebook, where you have 1.5 billion people together at the same time in some capacity exchanging things in real time. That was just not possible. And we're going to go further from there and continue to make new tools that will allow us to cooperate, collaborate at the scale of 6 or 7 billion people in real time around the planet, making something. And those things that we make in the beginning seem very kind of trivial. You're sharing photos, but will increase in complexity, so that we will build things. We will make things. We will make institutions with these new, using these new tools, and in every respect, including the institutions and the changing of the ownership. I mean, if you look at kind of like what Kickstarter does, where you kind of turn the funding away from a centralized model to the customers are funding their own products, ownership will change. All these things these options are now available because we have the new forms of communication and collaboration that were not available before. And all these things are social. social. We're social beings. These are social institutions. These are social media. This is social stuff. This is a type of socialism. It's not an ism in the traditional sense of an ideology and it has a dogma and a creed, but it is an ism in the sense that it is a perspective, a category. And so it's not the old Marxist form. And it also, I think, breaks another common conception that we have that you can only have the power of the group increase if the power of the individual decreases. And I think we're also showing that this technology can actually increase both at once. That it can be used to increase the ability of individuals to exert and the ability of the group to exert, and that it's not a zero-sum trade-off. It's what Bob Wright called the non-zero. It's a non-zero thing. Both sides are increasing, so there's not a trade-off in the classical sense.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question. I think that a lot of people who, one of the things that people look at that causes a lot of concern today is the widening wealth gap that's happening all through the developed worlds, already in the developing world. And it's pretty clear the way in which certain aspects of technology drive that particular mechanism. And that while other aspects may be ameliorated to a certain degree, the technology, both through automation, through trading systems and software, and then just through the way in which a great deal of wealth is developed by building the platforms within which sharing happens. So I share on Facebook and I create a kind of collectivity with the people that I'm connected with. I literally don't do this because I'm not on Facebook, but let's take that as the example. But, in the background, of course, a huge amount of money is being developed in all these kinds of ways. Do you see, so for me, the potential for this peer-to-peer world, for these new forms of technologically mediated socialism, it's not only really going to work when we can start moving in the opposite direction, that we start seeing the ways in which they help and feed this much wider range of people who aren't necessarily doing so well in our current environment. What for you are the most positive examples of the kinds of developments where we would see this sort of sharing economy, we would see this sort of collective economy moving outside swapping pet photos, or even working on a prestige project like Wikipedia where you get some kind of personal prestige by contributing to it, but something where we're really going to have more direct economic effects that maybe create some of the effects that we wanted traditional socialism to do in terms of safety nets, in terms of distribution of goods and resources.
Yeah. When I think of the disadvantage of the world, while there are many in the U.S., I think of mostly the many millions, if not billions, of people that I see in primarily where I go in Asia, Middle East, and trying to affect those folks there, to reach them. And so there's a hope in many technological circles that you could leapfrog development, that if you just send in the cell phones and the solar powered panels, that you don't have to, that you can just overcome the existing undevelopment and what they call leapfrog into the future. And in my own experience, I'm skeptical of that, because it doesn't seem to work. That to bring in the rest of the world to share in the benefits that technology is going, you actually still have to build roads, you still have to have clean water, you still have to have basic universal education, and that I just don't think that you can skip those. And so that's so there are some some really fundamental infrastructural things that needed to be done besides just bringing the internet to them. I will say that when people are given the choice, that they will buy a cell phone before they'll buy toilets, and that's because the benefits of the phone actually outweigh the benefits that they'll get from a toilet versus pooing in the back of the yard. But nonetheless, that's when they're using their own money. There's still governmental infrastructural things that need to happen that aren't happening, and that I think it's very hard for me to see digital socialism necessarily repairing that when there are just so bigger fundamental development that needs to happen to underpin it. And perhaps the communication aspect of it can accelerate that. People can voice their displeasure. They can vote. They can become educated. Elsewhere, there is a way that maybe that happens. I want to see the evidence about that. I'm not sure that that's sufficient. It can't hurt, but I'm not sure that it's sufficient. And so I'm not someone who believes that necessarily that just wiring up everybody else into the world is a solution to the inequality of the world.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It brings me back to my my economics upbringing, since in some ways the vision of this kind of plentiful, novelty generating a network of information is kind of riding on top of a certain idea of the market. Even though it's not the same thing, it overlaps and they feed each other in many ways. And then, of course, we have this famous idea of the invisible hand, which you'll still hear invoked as the kind of wisdom of the market. And there's this drive in our society for all sorts of reasons to try to bring everything you can into the market because some people believe it works better that way or some other people are making a buck out of it. But people always forget. You go back to Adam Smith, man. He's like, yeah, invisible hand, great. Markets, great. But it only works because there are these other institutions in society, both governmental institutions and cultural, frankly, religious institutions that can buff it, that can create a context, that can balance out some of the excesses of the market. And I think something similar can be said about the productivity of the internet and the way in which it provides so many opportunities, inspires, et cetera, and a lot of the ways you talk about in the book. But that to really have it work, we do still need things that are outside of it. Whether they're ethical systems, whether they're traditions, whether they're governmental structures that are using it, that are interpolated with it, but also have their sense of autonomy from it. And I think that's one of the scary things about this moment is it's very hard to see in the developed world where those other things are coming from in terms of how governments are working, et cetera, et cetera. Does that argument make sense to you?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing that will make you more pro-government than going to places that have no government, and you realize that there's a subsidy, that there's a huge scaffolding that is being provided by having just something like peace and law and order and these kind of very traditional conservative ideas that actually underpin the liberal progressive nature of the good stuff, and that you I mean, this is why tyrants can last so long, is because people will also often voluntarily trade all kinds of their liberal rights in order to just have peace and things running, even though, and this is, by the way, what China, this is what the billions of people in China, they're very aware of the cost of what they're giving up in terms of the Great Wall, the censor, the human rights. But they're consciously making a decision saying, yes, I will choose stability over freedom. And it's like, to us, it's like, well, how can you do that? Do you realize what you're doing? And they're saying, yes, we know what we're doing. This is what we want. We want stability because we have had crazy insanity in the past. We don't want another revolution. And so that's their choice that they're making. it's not going to last long. It's not very stable. Sooner or later, and they all know that. And the one thing that they always say is that, well, when it comes, we just don't want it to come as a revolution. Because then everything unravels. And so
we sure have given the autocrats some good fuel with the Brexit. I mean, if you want an example of a poorly handled experiment in democracy, you could do no better. I mean, it's really a remarkable event. And this, for me, this raises one of this issue of autocratic governments. Points to what in some ways is the most political chapter of your book, or at least the one where you most directly address the dark side or the potential dark side. And this is the chapter on tracking. And you start off talking about the quantified self, and you're talking about the way in which basically internet is tracking, and that producing data, and we're already tracked in all these different ways. And of course, this is a very big issue in people's minds, both in very legal driven, rational, logistical ways, and also in deeply emotional, psychological ways. I remain someone who is kind of revolted by the degree of sharing and tracking that people already participate in, and some of the scenarios you have in your book just frankly terrify me. I'd rather live in a cave. At least I think I would. Maybe when I'm actually given the choice, I'll say, screw the cave. I'll go with the tracking. But that aside, this is the one chapter where you go, okay, there's some real issues here, because if the degree of asymmetry that we're seeing now continues and intensifies, whether or not it's under an autocratic regime or our sort of democratic zone where the government and corporations have such an enormous power of tracking our behavior, and we have so relatively little ability, that some very scary things could happen. It's a place in your book where you point to the way that however wonderful the technology is, it can also be it is also deployed in different political situations, and that those issues of power and domination play an extremely important role in how this stuff is going to go out. So talk a little bit about that the way you address the fears around tracking and surveillance, and how you've come to think about it. And I ask this not specifically in terms of a position, like your intellectual position on how it's going to work, but even personally, even emotionally, in terms of recognizing the fears, recognizing the kind of old aspects of the human self that are threatened by this world, as well as the much more concrete political problems.
Yeah. So let me just first reference something you were talking about, which is the power, which is what I'd like to say is that the more powerful the technology, the more powerfully it will be abused. And so, we haven't talked about AI, but AI is probably the most powerful technology that we have made. It will be powerfully abused. That and tracking is a powerful technology for good, but it also will be abused. And I say very often that new technologies create new problems, almost as many as they solve. And the only difference between me and some other people who are maybe more critical of technology is I believe that the solutions to the problems that technology creates is more and better technology. That most of these have technological solutions that we can invent. In other words, that we invent the solutions rather than trying to prohibit, restrict, or turn back, or tone down, or whatever to withdraw from it. That the technology is like a thought made concrete, and that if I have a bad idea, the proper response to a bad idea is not to stop thinking or think less, but to have a better idea. And the proper response to a bad technology, we might say, is to not to have less of it or to stop technology, but to have a better idea. And so I think in the realm of tracking, I think the fact that we will track ourselves more and more, that we'll track others, will track us, we'll track our friends, corporations will track us, governments tracking us. When we look at virtual reality, that's a world that's made to track everything. All your emotions, all your behaviors, everything is captured in VR. It's going to be like the world's total surveillance world. All that's headed, and so the tracking is inevitable. There are things that we might do about it that aren't inevitable, that I think are choices, and that I hope that we can choose to do to make it civil, but I don't see any way out of more tracking. And so the question is can we imagine a world in which tracking is ubiquitous, but we're comfortable with it? And when I thought about our own human history of millions of years of evolution, we lived in tribes where every person knew every intimate detail about the other people. We were tracking each other, and we've been doing that for millions of years. We basically evolved in societies where there was total surveillance, mutual surveillance. And that's the difference. So I began to think about what was different between back then and now. And there's many differences, but the main general point was that it was not it was symmetrical at that time, meaning that I knew who was watching me, I watched them. I knew what they knew. I could correct them, so to speak. I could hold them accountable. And there was benefits in that mutual surveillance, what I call covalence. And so, to me, part of this solution of this ubiquitous tracking through technology is to restore some of that symmetry, which does not exist in many cases. So they know about me. I don't know what they know. I don't have much control over what they know. They're not accountable to me for what they know about me, and I often get no benefits directly from them from what they know. So the idea is if I can watch the watchers, if we can track the trackers. So yes, I think the cops should be filming things, but we should be filming the cops, and we should have access to what the cops film, and we should have access to what other people's films, and we should be filming the filmers, and we should be holding them accountable, etc., and we should get some benefits. So there's a sense of which David Brin calls it transparent society. And I think there's many different ways to make that, but that's the general direction that I think we need to go in order to redeem this world of total tracking. I don't think that we can stop it. I think there will be places that we want to limit it, that we come to a consensus and say, yeah, you don't want to be thinking about, you don't want to know what people think. I mean, I think our minds. We're not responsible for what we think, in a certain sense. I think we're responsible for what we do, and maybe that's where the line goes. But I do think it has to be mutual in a much greater sense than it is. And there are some challenges. It's like, how do you make Google knowledge about me symmetrical when they know not just about me, but they know about my neighbor? And so in some senses, it's not just me watching Google. I think I actually have to know sort of what Google knows about other people as well. There has to be a true sense of symmetry to this, which I think we're going to need additional technology to do.
Yeah, and when you describe all those things, again, I go through my sort of temperamental dystopian revulsion to these models, and then I go beyond that and I think about, okay, let's say, let's analyze that. Let's accept that some of this stuff is inevitable in your sense. And one of the things that I come to is that human beings on a real fundamental level have to change, are going to change in order to surf, to use a classic old verb, this new reality, which to me brings up some matters of the spirit. Both in terms of how we, alter our sense of our insides and our outsides and what we identify with and what our values are, but also just in the sense that in the case of knowing about all of these things, and even possibly knowing about what people are thinking, that we get close to something like telepathy, this weird old occult mystical idea that now people don't really take seriously for the most part. Some people do, but we are actually kind of building that sort of structure. And for me, this is only one of many examples, and I know that you have played with a lot of other ones in the comic book you did, The Silver Cord, where our technologies and some of our kind of mystical or religious sides begin to resonate. Something, of course, that I'm very, very, very fascinated with. And though we only have a painful 7 or 8 minutes left here, I would like to hear a little bit about that side of your of how you see things, not necessarily about tracking, but really about how our existing ideas of religion, of higher beings, of angels, whether or not we're talking fictional or real, but how that sort of world helps tell us something about where we're going, whether you talk about the silver cord or what motivated the ideas in that.
Yeah, I think most, there's just so much to say about it. I'm trying to think of where to begin.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a big thing, but I do think that there is a spiritual dimension to technology. And in my previous book, What Technology Wants, I kind of ended with a little bit of my emerging view, and I would say that the book was trying to attempt to make a theory of technology, and my current theory of technology is that it's an extension of the same self-organizing forces that run through the universe and made life and then made minds and is now making technology, and that it's sort of like that it's in some senses technology, even though it comes through our minds, it comes through any minds, and that it is bigger than us, and that it's the roots of this technological world and all the stuff that we're talking about actually come back to at least to the Big Bang, right? So that it's a cosmic force, and that that if you can go to any planet in the universe where there's civilizations, they'll see very similar forms. They're inevitable in that sense, and that we share with those other technological civilizations and technology, that they all have this kind of the same root in these self-organizing forces. And so whatever the genesis of that is, and in my perspective it would be God, that at least the roots are back to the very beginning of the universe, and that it is bigger than just us, and that what it's doing, where it's going, what it wants overall is this kind of increased possibilities of kind of filling out the world with as many degrees of freedom as possible, with as many minds as possible, and that when we are making things, even things that are kind of like going to go obsolete or be sold, or that we know are just kind of feeding the consumer machine, or they may just be novelties, let's say, that whenever we're making new things, we are participating in this long arc through the universe of increasing the possibilities in the world, and that we actually kind of have an obligation to, in certain senses, because it allows more and more people the opportunity for their particular variety of genius to be expressed and shared. And so in the same way that I've benefited from people in the past who invented printing and reading and writing, and Beethoven benefited by being born after the symphony instruments were invented, and Hitchcock and Lucas were all better off because they were born after someone had invented cinema technology. That there are kids today being born somewhere in the world, and many future generations waiting to be born, who are going to want us and depend on us to invent the technology so their genius can be expressed and shared. And so we kind of have a duty to kind of keep making these things, and we're participating in something really big when we do it. So for me, there is a spiritual dimension to this, which is that it's more than just our own whimsical human desires to have new stuff, that it actually is a bigger thing going on, which is this taking the inert, the entropy of the world running down, and that we are kind of building up increasing possibilities, increasing freedoms, increasing surprises, increasing choices, increasing variety, diversity in the universe. And that technology is sort of the acceleration of all of that. And it'll keep going and it'll go beyond us, and that we're part of this moment in helping it express the genius of the universe. And I think that's something that we should be reminded when we're making stuff.
Yeah, I love that. For some reason, the creed that comes to mind when you were saying that, laying out that beautiful vision, was the classic Vulcan philosophy of Erik, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. This great old sort of geek ethic through the Star Trek universe, showing that our fictional worlds and our religious possibilities are perhaps also not so terribly distinct. Well, we're going to have to.
Didn't I tell you that I was Vulcan? I didn't mention that. You didn't know that?
I didn't know that, Kevin. Okay. Now it all makes sense.
All right.
Well, I love it. That's a great place to end. Thank you so much for joining us on Expanding Mind, Kevin.
Yeah, it was really a pleasure. We should have more of these conversations. I so much enjoy your sensibility, your questions, and your own work, Erik. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we didn't even get to artificial intelligence, so we will have to have this conversation. Yes. Jesus. All right. Okay. Thanks a lot. And for folks, next week, who are we going to talk to? We're going to talk to Stephen Crimi about his book, Katabatic Wind, Mythology, and the Mysteries of the Grateful Dead St. Stephen. So join in. Till then, keep your minds open.
Bye.